All right, can you hear me? No? Probably ought to get started. Are you guys nervous? Must be just me then. Okay, let's begin in prayer. Father in heaven, as we come before you, we just would ask, Lord, that as we go through your law here and different things about it, that we would, as we study your word, Father, that we would glorify you by seeking to learn more about you and by just trying to think your thoughts after you. And we just pray that it would make a difference in our lives. We pray that, as we know, you use imperfect tools to accomplish your will. And so I just pray as we go through this that you'd use me, Father, as you would. Amen. All right, so the first thing I want to do is a couple of sort of house cleaning things here, some matters of clarification. As you can see here, this is the word altar, A-L-T-A-R. This is the word that I have been using verbally, and you can see it means an elevated place or a structure as a mound or a platform at which religious sites are performed or on which sacrifices are offered to gods, ancestors, etc. This is the word altar, which is it's a verb, and it means to make different in some particular as size, style, course, or the like. You can read that. To castrate or spay, I did not know that. To change, to become different or modified. And apparently, I have been using in my slides the word alter, A-L-T-E-R, when I meant to use the word altar, A-L-T-A-R. And so, for those of you who have been confused, I just want you to know it's because you're dealing with an idiot, and that's becoming more evident. And I would add that the person, one of you, had the grace to tell me that I was doing this. Otherwise, we'd still be doing it, I'm sure. And that person was very gracious and as far as I could tell, non-judgmental, which was in contrast with my wife, who, when I informed her of what I'd been doing, said, "Oh yeah, and you've been spelling Jehovah wrong too." So Jehovah is J-E-H-O-V-A-H, not J-E-H-O-V-A, in case you were confused about that. All right. I have to confess, I know that I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer. I've been aware of that for some time, but I am somewhat humbled by the idea that if the Lord tarries, and since this is being recorded, that 200 years from now, there will still be little digital pieces of my chubby little self out there making a fool of myself for virtually anyone to see. So that's heartwarming to me. Anyway, so that brings us to where we're at today, all right? So I guess we'll start out this way. If I'm correct, I think we ended up with the family of Jacob in Israel. We have gone through the history of worship and offerings and sacrifices, essentially from creation up until the point that the family of Jacob is now in Israel. And we have seen a few things here. We know, for instance, that there is a precedent for offerings and sacrifices. Okay? We've seen what looks to be like a tithe offering. We've seen several instances of what I would call either general worship or thanks offerings. These are the burnt offerings that we talked about. Noah offered one. Abraham's done that several times. We also have a precedent for something called a drink offering or a pouring out offering. We know, we've seen from the life of Abraham, and even before that, it says in the Bible, I think it's Genesis 6, after the birth of Seth's son Enosh, we know that there is a precedent for public and specific worship of Jehovah as God. Okay, so we have that precedent. we have an idea from Melchizedek, that there is some sort of organized system for the worship of Jehovah, complete with a contingent of priests, unless Melchizedek was the only one. But it's still, even if he was the only one, there seems to be some sort of organized system to worship Jehovah that had a priest, a mediator between God and man, if you will. Okay. We also, again, we have the precedent for individual worship without the need of a priest. Abraham worshiped God without a priest. Isaac worshiped God without a priest. Jacob worshiped God without a priest. And Hagar, if you will remember, worshiped God without a priest, without an altar, and without a sacrifice. Okay, so we see a precedent for that as well in the worship of God. All right? And then lastly, finally, we end up with this family of Jacob in the nation of Egypt, in the country of Egypt, and we know that when they leave in 400 some odd years, the law will be given immediately following their departure. Okay, so all of this is occurring. We have all these instances of worship of God without the law, essentially. Oh, I forgot to mention too, we do have in Job, we have some instances of what looks like some sort of sacrifice for atonement as well. Okay, so I want to discuss with you 3 more items then. The first item is Israel and Egypt. I want to get you a little background on that, and then I want to discuss Egypt as a world power, and then this should be cultural and religious practices of Canaan, and then if we get through with those, we'll get into the law specifics. Okay, so the first of these is Israel and Egypt. All right, I'm being a little flippant here, but I'm going to try to make the case to you that it's not that flippant. Okay, so I want you to consider now the family of Jacob, as we say. Okay, and if we step back in time a little bit, we take a look at Abraham. If we look at Abraham's life, we see that there's not really a lot, not that we're trying to pick anybody apart here or anything, but there's not a lot objectively about Abraham that we can really find fault with. If we really dig into it, there's a few things in his life we think, you probably could have done better. But, I mean, I can see John Henry out there laughing at something. I hope it's not me. Am I doing something wrong? Okay, all right. I'm a little sensitive now. Anyway, forgot where I was. Abraham. So, Abraham, this deal, he takes Sarah into Egypt and he lies about her, and we think to ourselves, you could have handled that a little better. He turns around and does the same exact thing with Abimelech, so we're a little disappointed to see that, and we think about the situation with Hagar and Ishmael, and none of that stuff had to happen. That was kind of it's just unfortunate, and we're disappointed in Abraham a little bit as we see that. But on the whole, taken in the big picture, when we look at Abraham's life, we have to say that we see that he seems to have the respect of his neighbors, does he not? I mean, everybody around him seems to respect him and like him, and he treats people fairly. There's that whole thing about bargaining for the cave in the field of whatever it is when he's going to bury Sarah. He treats his neighbors fairly. They treat him fairly. They seem to respect him. He seems to be peaceable, and yet at the same time, he's willing to stand up for himself and his property and his friends. He goes to war with Chedorlaomer and the 5 kings that attack Sodom and Gomorrah and carry off Lot. So he's not a coward or a chicken or anything like that. He's willing to do what he needs to do to protect himself and those close to him. So he seems to be civic-minded. We see him obeying God, doing what God asked him to do, even when it comes to the sacrifice of his own son. And so what we have here is just a generally well-respected, godly, what I would call godly man. Anyone in here would be happy to have Abraham as a neighbor, I think. And so we leave Abraham and we move to Isaac. Now, Isaac, we don't know that much about. And at least it doesn't seem that we get as much information about Isaac as we do about Abraham. But Isaac seems to be a decent guy. if Isaac has as close a relationship with the Lord as Abraham did, in my opinion, at any rate, it's not really developed in Scripture. I don't see that. It doesn't give us that. But we do see little snippets of his life. He clearly loves his wife, and he's not a bad guy by any stretch. He seems to be doing fine, and so we like Isaac. But if we read between the lines a little bit, we kind of see that he doesn't quite garner the same amount of respect from his neighbors that his father did. Isaac has to move because he keeps digging up the wells that Abraham had dug previously, and every time he does, the Philistines come in and say, hey, that's our well. Where Abraham had him uncontested, Isaac does not. Isaac has to keep moving. Finally, he moves far enough away where they quit bothering him, right? Man, I'm nervous. Stay with me. I'm winding up here. Okay. So he moves. He has to keep digging his well. He moves far away. They leave him alone. And then we see his relationship with his wife and his youngest son. They just don't seem to respect him, right? They don't seem to have the respect that we think maybe he should command here. And it just kind of makes us wonder a little bit about what's going on, in some of Isaac's life. But all in all, you wouldn't mind having Isaac as a neighbor either. And then we get to Jacob, right? And this is where the fun really starts. Okay, so Jacob, he's a piece of work, right? Apparently from the beginning. Okay, he has a brother. I don't know if his brother is just dumb or what, but apparently he's really passionate about certain things, and he's subject to making rash decisions. And Jacob takes full advantage of that, ruthless full advantage, and bargains this guy Esau out of his birthright. Okay, so he knows his brother's weaknesses. He plays on them. It's a selfish act. I'm not saying that Esau was without fault here. There's clearly a problem with both of these brothers, but Jacob does not act in an upstanding manner here, an outstanding manner. And then, just to kind of polish things off, he conspires with his mother to deceive his aging father, again, to this time outright defraud his brother of the blessing of the eldest, right? You guys remember all this, right? In doing so, he takes advantage of his father, who is in a weakened and frail condition. He absolutely takes advantage of him. He outright lies to him in the process. And just all in all, it's just not a good situation. So the other thing I'd like to point out about this is so if you'll remember the story, Jacob does all this stuff. Esau's mad at him, wants to kill him. Jacob takes off to go to Padan Aram, or whatever the name of that place is, where his uncle Laban lives, right? He goes out on a night's journey. The first place he gets to, apparently, he stops. He has this dream about the ladder, angels descending and ascending on this ladder. He gets up in the morning. And as a part of that dream, the Lord comes to him and says, hey, I'm going to fulfill my promise. The promise that I made to your grandfather and to your father, I'm going to also fulfill in you. Okay, I am going to make you into a great nation. Now, when the Lord made that promise to Abraham, what did Abraham do? He built an altar and he worshiped God. Okay, when the Lord made that promise to Isaac, what did Isaac do? He built an altar and he worshiped God. Well, let's take a look at, let me find my spot here. Let's see what Jacob does, right? The Lord comes to Jacob and he tells him starting in verse 13, it says, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And you and in your descendants all the earth will be blessed, right? And so Jacob gets up. He has this promise from God. He says in verse 18, this is chapter 28 of Genesis. So Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on its top. So we're good here so far, right? That seems to be in line with what everybody else did. He called the name of the place Bethel, which means the house of God. And then we get to verse 20. It says, then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. This stone which I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all that you give me I will surely give a tenth to you. So everybody else in Jacob's family, having received the same promise that Jacob just relieved, stopped and worshiped God. When Jacob gets the same promise, he turns around and makes a condition on it and says, well, if you do what you say you're going to do, and you keep me safe, and you make me comfortable, then, it's almost condescending, then I will let you be my God. Okay? So this is the sort of person we're dealing with Jacob here. Deception seems to be a part of his personality. It's ingrained. He uses it everywhere he goes. And then as we go on through this story, we begin to find out that nobody has a lot of respect for Jacob. He's lied to his brother. He's lied to his neighbors. And even his own family has no respect for him. And we see that in his sons, right? The sons of Jacob. If we start out with Reuben, he's the firstborn. Reuben sleeps with his father's concubine. And Jacob does apparently nothing about it. He knows about it, but he doesn't do anything about it. Okay? Then there's Simeon and Levi. If you remember the story, Simeon and Levi have a sister named Dinah. Dinah she catches the attention of a local prince, and he rapes her. Okay? After he rapes her, he tries to make up to her. He wants to take her as his wife. And you guys remember the story? Okay, I won't go into it then any further, but it's essentially he wants to make, as far as I can see within the context of the culture he's in, this guy wants to make good on what he did. He knows what he did was wrong, but he wants to take this girl and make her his wife. Simeon and Levi go in and say, well, we're okay with that. That'll be fine. Provided you take you got to do what we ask you to do. We want you to become circumcised. So the whole village gets circumcised, the whole city. Simeon and Levi then go into them while they're incapacitated and slaughter them. The whole entire city, and then loot it. Okay? So on the pretext, I would say pretext, I guess, if you give them the benefit of the doubt, on the opportunity afforded them by the revenge of their sister, they go in and they destroy this entire city and loot it. Okay? And then Jacob has to move again, and he says to him, what you've done has made me odious to all my neighbors around. So he actually has to move again. And I would put forth to you that this was complete. And anyway, we won't speculate, but it's just, it seems like an overreaction on their part to do what they did. Anyways, kind of, it's difficult to say here, but it looks to me like it's motivated by a lot of selfishness. But we'll give them, I guess, the benefit of the doubt. Then we get to Judah. Okay, everybody's favorite's Judah because we know David's going to come from him. The kings are going to come from him, right? Turn with me to Genesis 38. So there's this, right in the middle of Genesis, there's this weird story about Judah, right? Judah marries this Canaanite girl, and he has 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah, or something like that, right? In his turn, marries another girl named Tamar. Okay? is such a bad human being. We don't know exactly what he did, but he's such a bad human being that the Lord just kills him outright. Just says, I'm done with you. You're coming with me, or whatever God says when he kills somebody, right? So he kills Ur. And then there's this weird practice they have where when a woman dies without a husband, the brother-in-law has to go into her and make babies. Okay? So Onan goes into her. Now he's willing to go through the process of making babies, but he doesn't want to actually make any babies. Okay? So God disapproves of this, and he kills Onan. Now, I want you to just to, you don't have to turn there, but I just want you to point this out to you here about this odd practice that they have. If I can find my marker here, which, there we go. In Deuteronomy 25, verse 5. Now, this is the law. This is the Mosaic law as given further down the road. It's in Deuteronomy. It's given before the children of Israel go into, they've been wandering in the desert, and they're getting ready to go into the land. And this is the law that's given to them. It says this: when brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. It shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. But if the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He is not willing to perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall summon him and speak to him, and if he persists and says, I do not desire to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders, pull his sandal off his foot, and spit in his face. And she shall declare, thus it is done to the man who does not build his brother's house. So that's the law. That's the Mosaic law in Israel. Okay? Page back here 400 years, and there's the same principle going on in the culture that we find ourselves in, that Judah's in, right? So the question would be, first of all, isn't that a bizarre law? Right? We're thinking to ourselves, that's really bizarre, okay? But it's bizarre, and here we find the root of it 400 some odd years earlier. It's still there. So why might that be? Just ponder that in your head for the few seconds while I go on bloviating here. So then Judah, having lost two sons, says to himself, you know what? I'm afraid I might lose my third son. I only got one left. I don't want to send him into this Tamar. Apparently he's somewhat younger. And so he tells Tamar, he says, hey, Tamar, you go back to your folks' house, and when he's old enough, I'll send him. Okay, and you can be his wife. So she says, okay. She goes back to her folks' house. Time goes by. She realizes nothing's going to happen here. Judah's not going to fulfill what he told me he would do. So she finds out he's going to a sheep shearing thing. She sets herself up as a prostitute. He goes into her. She conceives, and he doesn't have any money apparently, so she takes from him a few items as collateral. And when they all part their separate ways, he tries to send and pay off the debt, but nobody can find the prostitute that he went into. And rather than draw attention to himself or whatever, he decides, you know what, I'm just going to let this matter drop. 3 months later, he finds out Tamar's pregnant. Okay, and he says, well, let's bring the full extent of the law down on her. Tamar says, hey, wait a minute. These belong to the person that fathered my child. And Judah says, oh, well, that's me. You know, we'll just let everything be bygones. And that's it. That's the end of it. That's chapter 38. It's right there in the middle of Genesis. There's it talks about the babies being born and things like that, but there's no context given, no nothing. you guys ever thought about that before? What's going on? I'm not an Old Testament scholar. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not well versed in a lot of ancient Mideast history, right? But let me just run something by you here. A theory of ignorance, if you want to call it that, right? So we see that God instituted this cultural thing that was going on. God has instituted it instituted? Must be. Anyway, instituted in his law this very concept, right? And so on the surface of it, we got to think, well, there must be some reason for that. Why would God do it? Right? And I submit to you that this is some sort of social safety net. Okay? Whereby a woman who was married, because a woman didn't have any rights of inheritance or anything like that, right? She couldn't really work. Nobody worked. I mean, you were all farmers, but not that you didn't work, but you didn't work for somebody else. You know what I'm saying? So a woman didn't have any means of support without a man. Okay, with either her father or her husband. Okay, so I think this is a social safety net. A woman is married to a man, the man dies, and she doesn't have any kids. She's not going to inherit anything. But if she had children, she would inherit the estate that would have gone to her husband, right? Because the male children would inherit that. And so that's the reason for the right. It's to give her male children so that she will have some means of support, some form of inheritance, right, as this comes down. So I think this is a social safety net. And I think at the time that this occurred, there was no law, so it was a cultural sort of agreement that this is just what you did in the culture, right? And Judah, in his infinite wisdom, has decided that he is going to violate this social mores and leave Tamar destitute. Now, she's back at her folks' house, but if her dad dies, she has nothing, right? Again, this is kind of speculation on my part. I don't want to mislead you, but it sounds good to me. So if that's true, then Judah here is willing to forego his duty as a father-in-law to supply her with a husband for selfish reasons, because he's afraid that he might lose his son, apparently. But he's willing to leave her destitute. And this is against the cultural mores of the time. However, when he finds out she's broken the cultural mores, she's become pregnant outside of marriage, he still holds her to the agreement. She's still technically engaged to his youngest son. And so what does he say? Let's bring her out and burn her. That's what the cultural system will allow him to do, and he's right on board with that. Okay, he didn't live up to his side of the bargain, but he's perfectly willing to enforce the full extent of the law against her when she doesn't live up to hers. Okay, and so we get this little snapshot of Judah's life right in the middle of Genesis, and we have to ask ourselves, why? What's going on here? Why do we get this? And I submit to you that this is the biblical writer trying to tell us in pictures here that Judah is a dirtbag. Okay? He does not uphold his end of the cultural bargain, and he is willing to kill this person in a terrible way because she does the same thing he does. Now, luckily for her, she seems to be smarter than him, and she gets around that. But anyway, so long story short, we have that. Now, okay, again, I'm not an ancient Mideast scholar, so you can take issue with that if you want to, but I'd like to hear a better reason why that random story is in the middle of Genesis there, if that's not it. And then moving past Judah, then we get to all the rest of the brothers. All the rest of the brothers are willing, first of all, to murder their other brother, their father's favorite. That's okay. They're willing to murder him. And then, when opportunity presents itself, they're willing to change their mind, and I think arguably even worse, sell them into perpetual slavery forever, and then keep up the deception, lie to their dad about it, and keep that up for what? I don't know, 15, 20 years probably minimum, right? These are the type of people we're dealing with when we say the family of Jacob. This is what moved into Egypt. And I would submit to you that if you live on the west side of Springfield and this group moved in next door to you, you would put a for sale sign in your yard immediately. Okay? These are not the sort of people that decent people, in my opinion, want to associate with. So this is a rough bunch. These are the sons of Jacob. All right. Now then, Egypt as a world power. The only reason I bring this up is because we have these people, they're immigrating into Egypt. Egypt is either at the time or will become, before the family of Jacob leaves, a world power. Right? And as a world power, they have a certain amount of, I don't know, cultural clout, if you will, right? And we know this, we see this. Okay? We see this in our world today. A world power has with it a certain standing, right? People all around the world want to sort of emulate world powers. And that's why we have, I can't remember what they call it, but that's why the American dollar is worldwide, right? It's a worldwide currency because America's a world power, or has been anyway. And so everybody wants to use our money. Is it default currency? Is that what they call it? Anyway, and our cultural practices, our music, our movies, all that stuff gets put out all over the world. People eat it up, right? Because it comes from a world power. People from all over the world are moving in here. Most of the time, when they move in here, they adopt our culture, they adopt our language, they adopt our ways, they convert to our religions, they become Americans. And that's normal. That's what's happened throughout the world. So it's no great stretch to imagine that as the family of Jacob moved into Egypt, they began to pick up Egyptian cultural mores and different things like that. Pick up the religion. Egypt is a polytheistic nation. They believe that Pharaoh is partly God or the son of the gods or whatever. And it's no great stretch for us to really think, is it that, incidentally, let me go back to Judah for just a second. This is also a matter of some speculation, but the whole thing about a prostitute being where Tamar was at the time of the year she was, that whole thing has connotations of being some sort of pagan fertility ritual. Okay, it was the spring of the year. The lambs are being sheared, shorn. Their hair's cut off. And, things are being planted. And the whole idea of this, this prostitute being there, that's all. It could possibly be associated with some sort of fertility ritual. And so we think, and we know that when Rachel came back from Laban, she took the family gods with her. We know that Jacob later on, when he moved, he gathered up all the family gods and he buried them under a tree, right? We know all this stuff. So we see that these people had a tendency towards polytheistic beliefs anyway. And now they're in the middle of Egypt here, that's a polytheistic nation. Is it a great stretch for us to think that perhaps these people are adopting the ways of the nation around them? I don't think so. Okay? And then finally we have the Canaanites, their culture and religion. Here we got the Egyptians, right? They're pagans, they're polytheistic pagans, but they're sophisticated, they're elite, they're a world power, right? They've got plays, they know mathematics, they've invented bowling, they're doing all kinds. They got an alphabet, they're doing all kinds of stuff. They're a great people. And we get to the Canaanites, right? And it's not that they don't have some of these things. I'm sure they're being affected by Egyptian culture as well. And they could read and write and do different, or at least some of them could. They build buildings and stuff like that. But these guys are they're barbarians, okay? They are mullet-wearing, meth head rednecks of the day, right? They're out there. Everything they do is like, it's just to the extreme. They live to party and fight, basically, and have sex with each other. That's their culture. They're everything kind of the Egyptians are not. They're so bad, in fact, that in Leviticus, again, when the law is being given, God specifically outlines their practices and says to Israel, you will not be like this. You will not do these things. Okay? And some of those things, even Americans won't do. So that tells you where we're at, right? So their gods, the gods that they have, are immoral. They're like the Greek and the Roman gods. They're immoral gods. They're petty. They're inconsistent. They're arbitrary. Just if you read through, they have thousands of gods, right? But this god's, his sister is, there's incest, and it's just a mess. It's a complete and total mess, right? That's what their worship is, and their worship practices involve child sacrifice, male and female prostitution, orgies, and bizarre animalistic rituals. Okay? All this stuff going on in Canaan. So, let's take a moment to reflect here a little bit. What exactly is going on? We have, now let's fast forward 400 years from where we started the class at. We have a people who have, in my opinion at least, a less than stellar moral and ethical history to draw on. Okay? These people have been under the rule of another country. Otherwise, they have not been autonomous on their own rule for at least 400 years. They've not been making their own decisions. They've not had any sort of governing process that they were a part of. All right? They have been under the political and cultural authority of a highly influential, advanced polytheistic nation for that same 400 years. Okay? But other than that Egyptian culture, they don't really have any unifying bond except for the fact that they're all descendant from this one family. Okay? These people, this group of people, there's some, 3 million of them or whatever, right, are being led now into a land which is populated by a pagan, hedonistic culture with a perverted and depraved view of spiritual and cultural living. Okay? And God, in His infinite wisdom, is planning on taking this group of people and making a nation out of them that represent Himself and act as priests to the world around them. So, if that's you, how are you going to do that? If you're God, how are you going to do that? And I would then submit to you this, that it appears to me that God is going to do that in His wisdom through the implementation of a national law. Okay? Now, the reason I've spent the last 3 weeks hammering all this home is because, and I think this is imperative to being able to look at the law in our context and understand what's going on. And this is the point I want to make, is that the law was given to a specific and unique people at a specific and unique time in history, in a specific and unique cultural and religious context, for a specific and unique purpose. And if you try to interpret the law today based on anything other than those specifics, you will go astray. And it will be confusing to you, and you won't understand what's happening. So we've already noted, right, that the law is not needed in order to worship God. We see that the law is not needed in order for man to be moral. We see that moral ideas and moral abilities existed before the law came into play. Okay, we will make the case further later, but I'll just make the statement that the law does not save from sin. This is backed up in the New Testament, but the law does not save from sin. And I would say, personally, I'm kind of developing the idea here. Now, this is just me, that the law talks about atonement. But I think in the way we think about atonement, the law does not atone. Okay? When we think of atonement, we think of a covering for sin. And I do think there was a sense in that the law did cover for sin, but not in the way we think about it. And when the law talks about atonement, so we break down the law into moral, civic, civil, and ceremonial law, right? Okay? When you read through the law, you will see God puts in specific instances where he says if a man breaks the law and he's unaware of it and he becomes aware of it, he can offer this sacrifice and it'll be an atonement for him. But I submit to you that what the atonement means there is it means he just is back in the covenant. The law was given as a covenant. We'll talk about that if we have time in a minute, if not next week, and we won't have time. But I submit to you that doesn't mean that his sins were covered for. And if you look at the law, what you see is that sin is never atoned for. There was no, look at the Ten Commandments. Then go through the law and find the sacrifice for lying. Find the sacrifice for adultery. Find the sacrifice for murder. There is no sacrifice. In fact, what the scholars say is there's no sacrifice. There's nothing in the law that will allow you that allows for the atonement of what they call high-handed sacrifices. But they're basically open rebellion, where you say, you know what, I know what's wrong and right here. I'm going to do what's wrong anyway. There's no atonement for that in the law. And again, I think if you look at the law, there's not atonement for sin, period. There's a way to get back into the covenant when you've done something out that excludes you from the covenant. That's done by sacrifice. But I wouldn't argue that point. I won't be dogmatic about it, but that's what it looks like to me. But at any rate, there's no atonement for the big sins, right? For breaking the Ten Commandments. It's not there. Okay? So the law doesn't provide for sin. You can't be made righteous. Again, now we're back to the New Testament. You cannot be made righteous by obeying the law. There's no sacrifice to come back in that. Okay? The law was not open-ended, and that's where we get into the covenant. The law is a covenant. And it wasn't given to anybody else. Nobody else was offered the law. Only the Israelites. You couldn't be the people of God if you were a Hittite or a Jebusite or an Amorite or an Amalekite, and you decided, you know what, the Israelites got something good. I'm going to do the same thing they're doing. I'm going to keep that law. That was not an option for you. The law was given to the Israelites, the nation of Israel, not to anybody else. The law was for them and for a specific purpose for them. It was not given to anyone else. Okay? Again, it was a bilateral covenant. Israel's part of the covenant is found in, I think, Exodus 19. In verse 5, God said, we're out of time here, but I just want to get done with this. God says to the people of Israel, he says, you yourselves, this is verse 4, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. So if Israel keeps the law, they will be to God a nation of priests and a holy nation. And they will receive all the material benefits that are outlined later that come from being the priests of God and a holy nation. If they don't keep the law, they're not priests, and they won't be a holy nation, and the covenant will be voided, and they'll get all the curses that come along with that. All right, I'm going to have to quit. There's more to say about this. We'll cover a little bit next week, and then hopefully begin to get into the specifics of the law. But I just want you to think about this. When you read the weird things in the law, the things about the mixing of seeds and the way you cut hair, different things like this, things that don't make any sense to you at all. When you read those things, think to yourself, okay, so you've got 3,500 years to provide confusion between us and the ancient Israelites and the giving of the law. But the law was given at a specific time in history, in a specific culture in history. And how might that affect some of those laws that we don't understand today? And hopefully we'll get into, we'll get into some of that in specifics, just for an example, next week a little bit. But, I mean, the Israelites weren't called, being holy means to be called out, be set aside for a task, okay? They were set aside to be different from what? Not different from you and I, different from that time and that culture, okay? All right, thanks for coming. See you around.
Question.